Okay, let's take a look at the feed wedge and see what it can do for you. The best way to access it is to open up the Reports tab, and this is where the predictive feed wedge lives. If you open it up on the farm dashboard, you also get access to the date selector here on the grazing to-do list, which means that the feed wedge will change based on the dates that you're displaying. So we can see we can make this bigger by just clicking on the map tab here. Now this just gives it more screen estate to play with. Now down the bottom of the feed wedge we have, or I'm not going to explain what a feed wedge is. You all should know it's, paddocks lined up in columns, things like that. So down the bottom of the feed wedge we've got some buttons. Now these are really cool because you can actually display the feed wedge in different ways. Now, if you're used to seeing the feed wedge go left to right, not right to left, then you can simply click the cover button. Now, I'm used to seeing the feed wedge go this way, so just might have to put up with that. And what we can do here with these three buttons is display the data in three different ways. The first two are very similar. So the first one is equal width. Now, this means that each column or each paddock is equal width, and we're just simply talking about kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Now, if we display relative to area, the feed wedge slightly changes. Now, this is because the columns now represent the width, or represent the area of the paddock by the width. So the wider the column, or the wider the paddock, the more area that paddock has, and the thinner the column, the less area that paddock has. So this paddock D3, we can see that it's quite a small paddock compared to this paddock. So if we show equal width D3, it makes it sort of tricks your mind into thinking, oh yeah, I don't really have a lot of feed just here. But then if we show relative to area, we can say, oh wow, this paddock here is quite large. So we do have a fair bit of feed in the top three paddocks. Now you can see that the way that the deficit here will change when I change the columns to equal width. So arguably there's less of a deficit here and more of a deficit here now. But if we go relative to area, we can see that this deficit has now reduced, and this deficit over here has slightly increased. Now, another way to show the feed wedge is to look at it as total feed available. So this is an equation where we multiply the paddock area by the pasture cover, so kilograms of dry matter per hectare times the paddock area. Now we can sort this feed wedge by feed. So we can now get a ranking of how much feed is available, total feed available on the paddock. So we know that, okay, we should be targeting this paddock over here if we're looking simply at total kilograms of dry matter in the paddock to graze, rather than what stage of biomass on a per hectare basis that paddock is at. So again, we can change this feed wedge around, and it also represents the days. So on this paddock, or on this feed wedge, we can see that light green paddocks are paddocks that are being grazed on that day. If we go back in time, we can see that paddocks swap around. If we go forwards in time, we can see that the paddocks are swapping around, and this deficit is slowly growing. Now, there are no paddocks recorded this far out into the future on this farm, so this feed wedge will just continue to grow. If we show relative area and then swap this back to cover, we can see that we've now filled in that deficit. So let's go back to the last grazing. Another thing we can do with this feed wedge is we can filter by various things. So in this case, let's filter by the milkers. Now we can see that this feed wedge is sitting at quite a big deficit if we're looking at the cover line. The cover line could possibly drop down to 3,000 kilos and so on, and the deficit would shrink a little bit. So that's all subjective to what the management style is at. Now, again, we can look at this feed wedge in various different ways depending on what your management practice is.